Welcome to the 2026 Dialogue, a masterclass series by the HR Association of India. I am Neha Jagnani, and today we'll be discussing a topic that has become increasingly critical for organizations operating across borders, cultures, and generations. Our theme for this session today is building high performance culture in a global workforce. To explore this important conversation, we are joined by Priyanka Mohanty. Priyanka is the Vice President HR and Global Head of Talent Management and DEI at Startek, a global customer experience company with a workforce of 38,000 plus employees across 13 countries. With nearly 2 decades of experience, she leads global initiatives in talent management, DEI, employee engagement, leadership development, employer branding, and cultural integration. A recognized HR thought leader, she has been featured among Asia's 100 power leaders in HR and India's 50 most influential HR leaders. Beyond her professional achievements, she has successfully completed expeditions to Everest Base Camp, Mount Kilimanjaro, and Mount Elbrus. Priyanka, thank you so much for joining. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you for having me, Neha. And it's a pleasure to be part of this conversation with the HRAI. I closely follow this platform and I truly appreciate the role that HRI plays in fostering collaboration and this knowledge sharing with the entire HR fraternity. So, yes, looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Priyanka, for your kind words, and I look forward to this exciting masterclass today. So, to begin with, Priyanka, my first question for you is building a high performance culture globally, sounds ideal, but what are the biggest challenges that organizations face in making it consistent across geographies?
I think that's a great question, Neha. And here I would like to start with a myth. Sometimes organizations think that culture perhaps can be standardized, like some policy document, like a process document. But, the fact is, yes, high performance cultures, they are built on common principles. That's right. But, in my experience also, I think they are experienced very differently across geographies. And, to be honest, I myself learned this very early in my career, I think much before joining HR. So I was a chemical engineer and I worked in the shop floor. And there I realized that, whether it was an operator working in the night shift or it was a supervisor working in the production floor, I realized that people, they don't follow vision statements. So what they follow are behaviors. And two factories, they could have the same policies, but the work culture could be completely different. And that would depend on the leaders on the ground. And I think over a period of time, I realized that the same principle applies globally. So over the years in my organization, I would like to give an example here that, we've done multiple mergers and acquisitions across many countries. So on paper, perhaps everyone had the same values. But, I realized that what ownership meant in one country was very different from what it meant in the other. Let's say what collaboration looked like in Asia was very different from what it looked like in the Americas. And that's when I realized that culture is not perhaps written on walls or, posters. It's something that people experience every single day. And, once we were doing a workshop, and that time there were leaders from different countries who had come together. And we were speaking of a term, accountability. So that time, every leader, they understood what this concept is. But when we asked them to write it down, the answers that they wrote were completely different. So some spoke about individual ownership, some spoke about, team success, anything. Because I think the culture or that they experienced in the geography was very, very different. And in our day-to-day life also, Neha, I'm sure you would have realized this, that, sometimes let's say, recognition. Sometimes employees want a public recognition in town halls. Others, they might want a private recognition, probably. And let's say in some cultures, feedback is appreciated. In other cultures, probably it might be perceived as confrontational.
Right.
So to answer your question, just to conclude it, the challenge is not creating a culture framework. I think the challenge is, helping those thousands of managers across geographies to interpret it properly and to demonstrate it continuously, over a period of time.
Sure.
And I think to end the answer, I always feel that culture is like gravity. You can see it, but you actually cannot see it,
Yeah.
but you will always feel its impact.
Right.
So the strongest global organizations, they probably don't make every office look alike. They are the ones who make every employee feel that they are part of the same mission.
Sure.
So that's my take on it.
Sure. Thank you so much for beautifully putting it together. I loved how you started that, people don't follow the vision statement. They follow behaviors and it applies everywhere. That's the only thing that will be constant in, in any geography. But it's very, very important that, you create those experiences in your ecosystem that people feel that they belong. So they are able to thrive in that ecosystem, irrespective of the geography. So thank you so much for that. Moving on to the next question, Priyanka, which is with teams spread across regions, how can leaders balance global standards with local cultural nuances?
Right. Again, that's a very important and pertinent question, actually. And to answer this question, I often use or I often think of this as a simple analogy. Let's take an orchestra. So in an orchestra, what happens is the music sheet that's global, but every musician who's present there, they will bring their own style, their own expression.
Right.
So similarly, organizations, they will need global standards around, maybe performance, it could be ethics, it could be talent reviews, it could be, leadership expectations, it could be customer experience, anything. So we do need global standards around that. That's for sure. But it is very, very important, that leaders understand local realities. They need to adapt to the communication style, probably to the recognition practices, and of course, the engagement approaches. They need to adapt to the local cultural nuances. Just to give an example, in some cultures, employees might openly challenge your ideas in a meeting. But in others, perhaps employees will keep listening. And I think that's their kind of showing respect rather than debating.
Right.
So if leaders don't understand these nuances, they probably may not interpret capability or they may not interpret engagement correctly.
Right.
And over a period of time, what has helped me also, and I would like to share an example here. Way back in 2010, when we institutionalized our DI model, diversity and inclusion model, that time, of course, E, equity, B, belongingness, nothing was there. So it was only DNI. So, and that was 15 years back. That time, we institutionalized a global framework of diversity and inclusion. And of course, it had multiple parameters, ranging from gender to persons with disabilities to generational diversity and many more.
Right.
Now, while the framework was global, what we did was, we left it to the geography leaders to interpret the framework and design interventions around that. And I can say that using this approach is what made our framework sustainable, for more than 15 years. It's still doing brilliant because while the framework is global, the interventions are local. And this same principle, applies to culture, as you said. So, create global framework, but we need to empower local leaders to decide the how. So it's like saying, the destination could be the same, but the route could vary.
Right.
So I think in the end, I would say that global leadership is it's not about exporting your perspective to the world. It's probably about I think I would say expanding our perspective because of the world. So,
Right.
and I think we as leaders, we really need to do this because that's how we can go ahead and we can balance global standards with local cultural nuances.
Sure, sure. Thank you
So,
so much. Just to summarize, Priyanka, we do need global standards, but we need to have an understanding of the local cultural nuances of, the region that you're dealing with. Global frameworks can stay, but interventions, need to be, implemented as per the fitment in the region, given the differences that are there. So the how needs to be defined while the vision and the global standards be in place. So thank you so much for your inputs. My next question, Priyanka, is what are the key drivers that truly differentiate a high performance culture from just a high pressure work environment?
yes, I think this, it's probably one of my favorite questions over the years because, and, I'm also guilty of this, that many organizations, they confuse pressure with performance. And sometimes, so high pressure, what does it say? Whenever you say high pressure, it just says deliver the numbers. But if we shift to high performance, what does high performance say? It says deliver the numbers, of course, but grow while doing it. So, in my experience, if you compare the difference, I think it boils down to three things. And I always use these three things, in my journey as well, and which I call the three C's, which is clarity, which is capability, and care. So when I say clarity, people need to understand what success looks like, what the vision looks like. When I say capability, so we as leaders or we as organizations, we need to empower our employees, with the requisite skills, with the requisite tools, and whatever support they might need in terms of resources.
Right.
And third is care. So, which means we need leaders who, genuinely care about the employees' growth, about the employees' well-being. And in fact, just to give you an example, I learned this, during one of the most defining initiatives of my career, which was 2, 3 years back when our organization shifted to a hybrid working mode. So it was the first time for us, when such a large workforce transformation happened. Working in a customer experience industry or BPO, it was very difficult because entire engagement happens in office. So when this transformation happened, no, this wasn't simply allowing people to work from different locations. No, it was a complete business transformation, which impacted, I think, more than half of our workforce. I would say more than 75% of our workforce, rather. And, what we had to do is we had to balance somehow contrasting business priorities. It's like clients, they will expect zero productivity loss. Business, it will require compliance, it will require operational continuity. And what our people wanted, they wanted flexibility, they wanted support, they wanted, somebody to look after their well-being.
Right.
So, at that point of time, there was a lot of pressure. So the easiest thing, that could have been done at that point in time was just to increase the pressure. Let's say more targets, more reviews, more monitoring. But, at that point in time, what we did was we took a different approach. And that's when my favorite, the three C's, which I say, clarity, your capability and care, that we brought that into action.
Sure.
So we redesigned all the talent processes, right from your hiring to engagement to learning. So we invested in learning ecosystems, we invested in well-being, and we ensured that, managers, they had a meaningful conversation with their teams, rather than just simply expecting output.
Sure.
So, and trust me, Neha, the results were remarkable. I remember we successfully onboarded more than thousands of people, through these redesigned talent processes. There were internal career progressions, there were rewards and recognitions. We rewarded people who exemplified our values. Then, the employee engagement was at an all-time high. We had a very positive ENPS score. Of course, we were compliant also, 100% compliant globally. But, most importantly, we achieved a nil or a zero productivity loss. And we also secured the client confidence and approvals. So I think that experience, it reinforced something within me. And I realized that, people don't just perform under pressure. I think people perform when they are empowered.
Right.
And high performance cultures, they will not ask you to perform, just perform. So they will make your performance possible because they will not just focus on outcomes at any cost. It's all about sustainable excellence. So I think that is what probably differentiates, a high performance culture from a high pressure work environment.
Sure,
So
sure. Thank you.
that's my take, Neha.
Absolutely. Thank you for beautifully drawing, firstly, the difference between high pressure and high performance. Pressure, you said, is basically, delivering the numbers. But when it comes to high performing, it's you grow when you're delivering the numbers. A beautiful example there of your own organization that, reinforced how clarity, capability, and care makes a real difference. And I think it's in the time of ambiguity is when things, push you to create pressure. Everything is worrisome and you're in the times of disruption redesigning thing. But if you use clarity, capability, and care, beautiful example there that how it can create an ecosystem where people thrive even in when things are changing and transforming. So thank you so much for sharing that. It's
Absolutely.
truly inspiring. My next question, Priyanka, is how can organizations ensure that performance, engagement, and well-being go hand in hand in a global setup?
Yes. I think again that's very, very important. And honestly, Neha, I don't view these three as three separate priorities. I probably see them as three legs of the same stool. So if we kind of remove one, then the entire system becomes unstable.
Right.
And if you would have noticed also, since many years, organizations have been measuring productivity. But today, if you see, things have changed. And many leading organizations, they measure productivity, they measure engagement, they measure employee experience, and all three of them they measure together. So that's one of the biggest things that has changed. And honestly, I think one of the biggest mistakes, which probably we sometimes do, is assuming that engagement and well-being, they are soft metrics, and performance is a hard metric. So in reality, if you see, engagement and well-being, they are your leading indicators of performance.
Right.
So that's where we need to differentiate, because if people are burnt out, if people are not able to see a future for themselves in that organization, then their performance eventually suffers. Because I believe that employees, they perform the best when they are valued, when they are inspired, and when they are supported. And again, I would like to give a small example here. Again, in my own organization, a few years ago, when so we thought that we wanted some sustainable performance. So we planned to develop a leadership pipeline and create growth opportunities for people. But here the difference was we needed to create visible growth opportunities. So, of course, we institutionalized and we kind of reinforced our succession planning process and our talent review framework,
Right.
which of course was supported by our proprietary competency architecture. But, the difference here was that this was not just another talent review exercise. So here the objective was not just to identify leaders. Here we needed to answer a very pertinent question, which is that I, as an employee, can I see my future here?
Right.
Because when employees see a future in the organization, I think they become more engaged in the present. And when we did that, there were multiple people who were identified as hyper hypos. There were multiple career progressions. We reduced our top talent attrition, and our engagement score also improved. But what I found interesting was, none of these outcomes happened because we focused only on engagement. No, these outcomes happened because we focused on growth, we focused on development, and we focused on opportunity. So, when people see growth, I think performance improves. And just to end it, I often compare this with mountaineering as well. So I've had the opportunity, as you said, to trek to Everest Base Camp, Kilimanjaro, and Elbrus. And I realized that, when you are climbing a mountain, nobody talks about just reaching the summit. You spend weeks preparing. You have your focus on acclimatization. You focus on recovery. You focus on supporting the team. Because if people get exhausted in day two, nobody will probably reach the summit on day seven.
Right.
And organizations are exactly like that. I say that performance is the summit, engagement is the energy, and oxygen is the well-being. So that's why we need to see all three of them, in as three legs of the same stool. So,
Correct.
and that's when your sustainable performance will be for years to come, not
Sure.
just for a quarter or for a month.
Absolutely. Great example to end with. And as you rightly said, that earlier you used to see engagement and well-being as soft matrix and performance as hard matrix. Now the lenses have changed. People see them differently because these are the true indicators of performance. The more you focus on growth and opportunities for your employees, the more are the chances that they will thrive in that ecosystem. They will, perform better. So thank you so much for that. This brings us to the last question, Priyanka, which is if you had to give one clear message to leaders, what should they start doing today to build a strong, high performance culture across their global teams?
So I think, Neha, it's very simple, and it probably is a summary of what I've just said before. My message would be that let's stop trying to build a culture. I think we just need to start building leaders, because I believe that employees, they experience culture not through PowerPoint presentations, not through values, not through town halls, but they will experience culture through their managers. Perhaps a manager who recognizes their effort, a manager who gives honest feedback, a manager who creates opportunities, a manager who listens. And in my journey also, and it's a very well-known fact that I've learned one thing, that employees will not leave strategies. They will leave experiences. And who creates these experiences for them? The managers or the leaders. And in my early career also, I used to think that, okay, culture is shaped by policies, by processes, but no. You can have two teams who can work in the same organization under the same policies, with the same benefits, but still they will have a completely different employee experience. Why is that? That's because of leadership. Perhaps one manager creates trust, the other manager creates, fear. One manager might develop people, and the other manager might just manage tasks. One manager might, praise your discretionary effort, while the other manager probably manages compliance. So we as leaders, we just need, to understand this and sometimes not underestimate the impact of small moments, like probably a career conversation, a coaching conversation, etc. So, just to end, I believe that culture is not built in a town hall, because people might forget your strategy, your policy, your processes. I think what they will remember is, what are those thousands of leadership actions that we as leaders have consistently done over a period of time. So they will never forget working with you as a leader, and that's, I think, where true culture begins. So make them feel valued, included, and inspired.
Sure, sure. Very fundamental yet very critical takeaway in one line is focus on building leaders and not culture. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
This brings us to the end of this session, Priyanka. On behalf of HRAI, I thank you for your invaluable insights today. It was my pleasure hosting you today. And today's discussion highlights that building a high performance culture does not really require just the vision statement or performance matrix. It requires how much you care about your employees, how much growth opportunities you present for them to thrive. So thank you so much for your insights today. It was lovely talking to you.
Thank you so much, Neha, for the engaging conversation. And, it's been a pleasure sharing my thoughts. And I love the way you brilliantly summarized, the conversation and captured the entire essence. So thank you. And I wish you and the HRI team continued success in this journey.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for your kind words. Thanks for your time and inputs. Thank you.
Thank you.